You're not here to play small. You're not here to settle for the life that showed up by default. You're here to master the levers behind what appears as fate, coincidence, and circumstance. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the most misunderstood, misrepresented, and misused forces in the human experience: the interaction between consciousness and the quantum field. This is not about wishful thinking. This is not about hoping hard enough that your life improves. This is about learning the mechanics behind how reality actually locks into place. How outcomes are not attracted but resolved through precision, through structure, through identity. In this episode, you're going to explore Neville Goddard's three-phase collapse formula, a framework so potent that when correctly applied, it rewrites the energetic script that binds you to any unwanted reality. Not metaphorically, mechanically. Because here's the truth most people aren't ready for. You are not a passive observer in a pre-written movie. You are not a victim of random cosmic roulette. And you are definitely not an energy magnet, just floating around hoping to pull in better experiences by wanting them enough. You are a node of consciousness within a probabilistic matrix. And every moment, every belief, every assumption, every identity loop acts as a filter through which infinite possibilities either resolve into form or remain collapsed in potential. The quantum field doesn't care what you want. It only cares what you are. So today, we're going to strip away the spiritual fluff and decode the real logic behind personal transformation. You'll learn why your current circumstances persist, not because they're meant to, not because you deserve them, and certainly not because of karmic punishment, but because you're unconsciously stabilizing them with the wrong parameters. You'll learn why trying to attract something new can actually reinforce the very reality you're trying to escape. You'll understand how most manifestation teachings completely ignore the core variable, identity frequency. And most importantly, you'll walk away with a complete blueprint for exiting any reality loop that no longer serves you. That's not exaggeration. That's physics. That's logic. Here's how we're going to do this. We'll start by exposing the hidden trap inside the law of attraction paradigm. Then we'll introduce you to the geometric nature of identity and how it acts like a selector switch inside the quantum field. Next, we'll break down the three phases in Neville Goddard's collapse formula: revision, assumption, and persistence. Each one is precise. Each one serves a function. Each one plays a role in collapsing the probability wave of an unwanted experience and replacing it with a stabilized new timeline. But this requires more than understanding. It requires alignment. It requires calibration. It requires the courage to stop outsourcing your power to external forces and instead become the operator of your own frequency system. You're going to see how your emotional resonance is not just energy in the vague sense. It's a directive encoded in waveform that communicates which timeline you're requesting to stabilize. You'll see how memory itself can be rewritten to disrupt the gravitational pull of past trauma. You'll discover that the future isn't something you wait for. It's something you assign yourself to, like setting coordinates on a GPS. And you'll never look at failure the same way again. Because what feels like resistance, chaos, or breakdown is often the exact signal that collapse is in progress. And your nervous system is trying to cling to a reality you're already slipping out of. This is not about becoming something new. It's about returning to the original mechanism that was always yours. The ability to encode identity with precision and let that identity anchor a new trajectory. This is the new frontier of reality engineering. Welcome to it. Let's begin. There's a reason so many people invest years, sometimes decades, into manifestation teachings, only to end up right back in the same place, recycling affirmations, vision boards, and high-vibe mantras. They aren't lazy. They aren't blocked. They aren't broken. They're simply using the wrong operating system. The law of attraction, as popularized over the last 2 decades, suggests that your thoughts and emotions emit a magnetic frequency that attracts similar energies. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Emotional states do carry charge. Beliefs do color perception. But here's where the trap lies. The very act of trying to attract something inherently confirms that you don't have it. More dangerously, it subtly reinforces that your identity is separate from the version of you who already lives in that reality. This creates an energetic split. You become both the seeker and the signaler. You are broadcasting desire but anchoring in absence. You're instructing the quantum field to reflect lack, because your identity hasn't changed. This is why Neville Goddard's teachings are fundamentally different. He never taught people to wish. He never told anyone to visualize harder. He taught people to assume the state of the wish fulfilled. Not from hope, not from fantasy, but from the knowing that identity precedes outcome. This isn't about being positive. It's about being precise. In quantum mechanics, there's a principle known as the observer effect. At its core, it states that the act of observation changes the state of what is being observed. But this doesn't just mean looking at something. It means how you frame it, what reference point you bring to it. And here's the kicker. Your identity is the reference point through which you observe reality. So when you attempt to manifest money from the identity of someone who needs more money, you're not collapsing the possibility of wealth, you're reinforcing the wave pattern of scarcity. When you try to attract love from the perspective of someone unloved or alone, you don't resolve the pattern, you amplify the signal of lack. This is why the traditional model keeps you trapped, because it puts the outcome at the center. Rather than the operator of the outcome, you. Neville taught that your assumptions hard-code the structure of reality. He emphasized that you do not attract, you select. And selection is not emotional. It's structural. It's not a feeling. It's a shift in the architecture of your self-concept. When you say, I am healthy, but your subconscious identity is still entangled in being unwell, the field reads the identity, not the words. When you write, I am wealthy, but your body contracts every time you check your bank account, the field stabilizes the contraction, not the affirmation. This is why Neville insisted that the feeling must be realized, not rehearsed, not staged, not fantasized. Here's the hard truth. Wishing to attract something is passive. Selecting an outcome is active. And assuming the identity of the version of you who already has it, that's how you collapse everything that says you don't. It's uncomfortable, it's confronting, but it's effective. Because when you stop trying to attract and start working through the structure of self, you stop battling circumstances. You stop fighting the mirror. You stop negotiating with timelines you never actually chose. Let's get brutally clear. Trying to manifest from your current identity is like trying to run new software on an outdated operating system. You might get lucky. You might feel motivated for a few days. But the system will always revert to its default code unless you rewrite the core. That core is who you believe you are. And that belief is encoded through repetition, emotion, expectation, and most powerfully, assumption. Assumption isn't fantasy. It's a tuning fork. When you assume the identity of someone free from struggle, the field begins to reconfigure. When you maintain that assumption without needing proof, you stabilize a new feedback loop. The formula we're about to explore isn't a philosophy. It's a mechanism. Now think carefully. How much of your current life is a result of identity inertia? How many of your patterns are simply echoes of past assumptions? And how much energy have you wasted trying to attract what you could have selected, if only you changed the operator? This is why Neville's formula starts with collapse. Your reality isn't shaped by goals. It isn't shaped by vision boards, desires, or even emotions alone. It is shaped by structure. Invisible, energetic structure. Structure that forms the geometry of your identity. And this geometry functions like a grid, a lattice that filters every interaction, opportunity, and outcome available to you. You are inside that lattice now. You've been inside it since the moment you began to interpret reality through a specific lens of self. That lens didn't arise by accident. It was sculpted over years through repetition, experience, emotion, and interpretation. But here's the important part. It's not permanent. It's malleable. And because it's malleable, it's hackable. Every identity state you inhabit emits a specific configuration of thought patterns, emotional responses, expectations, and perceptual filters. These are not abstract psychological traits. They are energetic designs. Designs that tell the quantum field, this is who I am. Resolve reality accordingly. You're not just living life, you're stabilizing a geometry, and that geometry acts like a signal lock on a narrow bandwidth of possibilities. Until the geometry shifts, your outcomes won't. Not because you're stuck, but because you haven't changed the design of what you're sending out into the field. This is why Neville Goddard emphasized the concept of living in the end. To many, that phrase sounds poetic, something you might write on a sticky note to feel more hopeful. But the real meaning is far more radical. To live in the end means to inhabit the identity geometry of the version of you who has already resolved the desired reality. Not wishing, not pretending, not acting as if, being. Here's where people get confused. They think, if I act like it's already done, won't I be delusional? No, because you're not ignoring circumstances, you're altering the selector geometry. And in doing that, you are telling the field, collapse all other outcomes except the one that matches this new identity. This isn't magic. This is precision. Just as a tuning fork vibrates in harmony with its resonant frequency, your identity geometry resonates with specific outcomes, and not others. When you shift identity, you shift resonance. When you shift resonance, you change what the field can collapse into matter. Let's look at it from another angle. In systems thinking, feedback loops govern the stability of a system. A system continues in its current pattern unless disrupted by an input that exceeds its threshold for change. Your identity is a feedback system. Every thought you think reinforces who you believe you are. Every reaction you have reinforces how the system interprets stimuli. Every decision you make stabilizes the attractor field of your current self-concept. This is the geometry at work. It's not emotional fluff. It's patterned logic. And it means that any attempt to change your life without restructuring your identity lattice is like trying to update the contents of a book by painting the cover. The inner configuration remains untouched. Let's be clear. You don't get what you want. You get what your identity can hold. That's why people can win money and lose it within months. That's why people can fall in love and sabotage the relationship. That's why success without internal congruence leads to self-destruction. Because the geometry is misaligned. The identity cannot support the outcome. It's like putting high voltage through a circuit that wasn't wired to handle it. It will fry. So the system collapses back to what it can maintain. Now here's where it becomes empowering. If the geometry of identity is patterned, then it's reprogrammable. And that's exactly what Neville's formula teaches. It doesn't ask you to earn your outcome. It asks you to become the version of you who's already living it. To stabilize that identity through repetition, feeling, and mental rehearsal until it replaces the old lattice. And when that new identity geometry becomes dominant, reality has no choice but to follow. The field doesn't respond to requests. It responds to structures. So stop focusing on attraction. Start focusing on alignment. To close this loop, understand this. The field is not personal. It's responsive. It resolves into form based on what you stabilize through identity geometry. If you change that geometry, you change your life. Not slowly, not eventually, but systematically. And that's exactly where we go next. To exit an unwanted reality, you first have to break the anchor that's keeping it in place. And that anchor is almost always in the past. Not the actual events, but the interpretation, the memory, the emotional charge those events still hold. This is why Neville Goddard taught revision as the first phase of the collapse formula. Not because it's therapeutic, but because it disrupts the continuity of identity. In neuroscience, we know that memory is not fixed. Every time you recall a memory, you enter what's called a reconsolidation window. In that window, the emotional coding of the memory becomes plastic, malleable, open to being re-encoded. Neville understood this intuitively. He instructed people to take any painful, limiting, or disempowering event and rewrite it. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally in the imaginal act. He taught that by consistently revising the scene and feeling the truth of the new version, the identity structure built on that memory would begin to collapse. And here's the real key. When you collapse the emotional pattern of the past, you remove the field's instruction to repeat it. That's the real power of revision. It breaks the feedback loop. It destabilizes the gravitational pull of your old self-concept. Because every unwanted reality you experience today is built on layers of encoded assumptions from yesterday. So to collapse the current state, you must go upstream to the moments that encoded it. Find them, shift them, and repeat the shift until the nervous system accepts it as truth. But how does this relate to quantum theory? In quantum physics, a system exists in multiple potential states until it is observed. This is the superposition principle. The act of observation collapses that field into one outcome. Your memory works the same way. Every time you recall an event, you are reselecting one version of that event from a field of possible interpretations. By repeating that selection over and over again, especially with emotional charge, you stabilize one version of the past as real. But here's the twist. If you can observe the memory differently, consistently, and emotionally, you begin to collapse a new version as dominant. Not just in your mind, but in your energetic signature. And once your signature changes, the field adjusts accordingly. This is why Neville taught, change your conception of yourself and you will automatically change the world in which you live, because your world is a projection of your inner lattice. And the past is the foundational layer of that lattice. So by revising the past, you are repatterning the very blueprint from which the present is being generated. This is not denial. This is reconstruction. This is timeline manipulation at the root level. Here's how to do it. Identify the memory that holds charge, something that defined you, limited you, or created fear, shame, or resignation. Rewrite the scene as if it unfolded in a way that empowered you. Not vaguely, but in vivid detail. What was said? How did you feel? What changed in that moment? Feel the new version as real. You must accept it emotionally, not just mentally. Repeat the new version daily until your nervous system normalizes it. Over time, the old version loses its grip. And with it, the behaviors, beliefs, and assumptions that sustained your current reality dissolve. In systems theory, this is known as disruptive input. When a strong enough input contradicts the current system state, the system has to recalibrate. Revision is your disruptive input. But here's the catch. You must persist. The old structure won't collapse immediately. It will resist. It will try to reassert itself. This is why people give up. They think the revision didn't work. But collapse is a process. You are untying energetic knots. And each repetition unties another loop. Eventually, the structure fails. And when it does, something new emerges. You're not fixing the past. You're reassigning it. You're removing its power to shape your current identity. And that is the first essential move in exiting any unwanted reality. Because until the old anchor is cut, no amount of effort will move the ship. So now you know, reality doesn't shift through force. It shifts through structure. And revision is how you start editing the blueprint. Next, we will move forward to the second phase of the formula. Assumption, the act of choosing a new timeline not through desire, but through identity precision. The second phase of Neville Goddard's collapse formula is where the mechanism tightens. The first phase, revision, dismantles the energetic weight of the past. It disrupts the stabilizing memory patterns that once acted like anchors. But once that disruption creates space, the field requires a new instruction. That instruction is assumption. An assumption is not a mood. It is not hope. It is not a method of bypassing reality. It is the act of selecting a new state with finality. Not because evidence confirms it, but because you, the observer, have declared it to be true. Here's what most people misunderstand about assumption. They believe it's something you do for 5 minutes in meditation, then return to your daily life. They think it's about saying, I am statements until they feel good for a moment. They mistake it for a technique. It's not. It is a replacement of being. It is a hard switch in identity. Neville taught, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. But that statement only makes sense when you understand that feeling doesn't mean emotion. It means beingness. It means the felt sense of identity that says, "This is who I am now." Let's break it down through a quantum lens. In quantum physics, the principle of superposition says that all possible states of a system exist simultaneously, until one is selected by observation. The observer doesn't pull one out of thin air. The observer collapses all other options into irrelevance. This is precisely what assumption does. It doesn't create a new reality. It selects from among infinite existing probabilities, and collapses the rest through the consistency of identity. You are the selector, but only when you stop oscillating between old identity and new desire. The field cannot resolve two conflicting instructions. It cannot stabilize both "I am wealthy" and "I don't know how to pay my bills." It reflects back the dominant geometry, and that geometry is formed by assumption held without contradiction. Think about how you assume your name. You don't wake up questioning it. You don't try to believe in it. You don't repeat it to convince yourself. You simply are it. That's the quality of assumption Neville taught. The moment you assume a new identity as done, you signal the field, collapse all incompatible outcomes. Not eventually, now, but, and this is critical, the collapse only stabilizes when assumption becomes your primary reference point. Not your emotional high point, your default mode of being. So how do you apply this? You begin by asking, what version of myself already lives in the outcome I desire? What does that version assume as normal? What is unquestioned in their daily experience? Then, you begin to embody those assumptions not as pretend behavior but as new reference geometry. For example, if you want to move from scarcity to abundance, stop trying to feel abundant. Start assuming that abundance is normal, boring, unremarkable. Start anchoring into the identity where lack is no longer part of the story, not even worth mentioning. That's how you switch timelines. Neville was clear. The world is yourself pushed out. In other words, your experience is a mirror of the assumptions you carry. So if you want to change the mirror, don't change the reflection. Change the one casting it. Assumption doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It doesn't try. It states. Claims. It acts with inner finality. When you assume a new reality, you don't act as if. You act from. This distinction is everything. Most people act as if they're confident, hoping the feeling sticks. Neville taught, assume you are confident and let the behavior naturally emerge. You don't perform the role. You become the version of yourself who never needed to. There's a term in systems theory called phase transition. It refers to the moment a system reaches a tipping point and transforms into a new state. Ice melts into water. Water boils into vapor. In identity work, assumption is the phase transition. It's the precise energetic signature that causes the system of you to transform. When sustained, it creates a ripple effect. Thoughts shift, behaviors shift, feedback loops shift, and the field begins to conform to the new input. Here's the challenge. Assumption feels unstable at first, because your environment won't instantly reflect it, and your nervous system may panic. But your job is to hold the identity long enough for the field to reorganize. That's not ignoring reality. That's training reality by refusing to revert. The field follows consistency. An assumption is the most powerful form of consistency available to you. So pause now and ask yourself, what have I assumed about myself every day for the past year? What identity have I stabilized without realizing it? And what would change instantly if I selected a new one without negotiation? That's the power on the table. That's the second phase of the formula. Next, we will move into the deeper mechanics behind emotional resonance, why it is not just fuel for transformation, but the true time machine of identity-based quantum shift. Every version of you already exists. Every possible life path is accessible. But not all of them are resonant. This is where most people miss the core mechanism behind reality selection. They focus on thoughts. They focus on affirmations. They focus on scripting. But the real key is resonance. Emotional resonance. Think of resonance as the bridge between consciousness and the quantum field. It is not just how you feel. It is the waveform of identity, and it tells the field, this is the version of reality I am harmonizing with. Resolve accordingly. Every emotion you sustain for more than a few seconds generates a signal. That signal, encoded through your nervous system, broadcasts a frequency into the field. And that frequency selects, not because emotion has mystical properties, but because emotion reflects alignment with identity. Here's why this matters. When Neville taught the feeling of the wish fulfilled, he wasn't talking about generic good vibes. He was referring to the emotional signature that emerges when your self-concept locks into a specific outcome. That lock-in creates resonance, and that resonance bends time. Because time is not linear, it is conditional. And when you shift your emotional base state, you realign with the version of reality that corresponds to it. Let's bring this down to a logic-based example. Think about how you feel in grief. The past dominates. The future collapses. Your entire timeline contracts. Now think about a moment of breakthrough. The future expands. The past feels distant. Your identity loosens. That's not psychological, it's vibrational. Your emotional state isn't just a response. It's a selector switch. The longer you sustain a particular resonance, the more stable the selected timeline becomes. And eventually, the external world begins to reflect that choice. But here's where people get confused. They chase peak states. They try to generate emotional highs, thinking that will speed up manifestation. That's not resonance. That's turbulence. It's unstable. What creates collapse is stabilized resonance. A sustained emotional baseline that communicates consistency to the field. That's when the timeline begins to shift. This is also why revision is so powerful. When you rewrite the emotional imprint of the past, you neutralize the signal that was anchoring you to a specific loop. And when you pair revision with assumption, you begin transmitting a new resonance that pulls you into alignment with an entirely different life trajectory. Not because the future changed, but because you changed and the field adjusted accordingly. Emotional resonance is also the key to time distortion. When you are emotionally congruent with a desired outcome, it often shows up faster than expected. Not because you bent time, but because time is a function of identity continuity. Change the identity, and time reorders itself. That's why it feels like things just happen once people align. The timeline didn't accelerate. You moved to a version of yourself where that outcome was already standard. This is not magical thinking. It's logical identity physics. The version of you that lives a radically different life already exists. But you can't access it from your current resonance. You must match the signal. Emotionally, energetically, routinely. This is why it's not enough to think differently. You must feel from the new state. You must saturate your nervous system in the feeling of, this is now normal. Not exciting. Not ideal. Normal. And that's what locks the resonance into place. Ask yourself right now, what emotional state have I stabilized as normal over the last 6 months? What timeline has that state been anchoring? And what resonance would I need to install to make another version of my life become inevitable? That answer is not in your goals. It's in your baseline. Shift the baseline, and the whole structure responds. Neville's teachings weren't poetic, they were precise. He understood that feeling is the mechanism of selection, and resonance is the proof of assumption. So you don't need to wait. You don't need to attract. You only need to match. And when you match, the field collapses into compliance. Next, we will move forward to the third and final phase in the formula, persistence, and how your willingness to hold the new identity through resistance becomes the stabilizer that locks in the timeline you've chosen. The moment you assume a new identity, the collapse begins. The quantum field doesn't hesitate. It begins to reorder reality according to the new instruction. But what most people fail to realize is that initiation is not the same as stabilization. And the only thing that turns an assumed identity into a fixed trajectory is persistence. Persistence is not repetition for its own sake. It's not rigid behavior or daily ritual without purpose. Persistence is the mechanism that prevents the field from reverting your reality to the previous default. When Neville Goddard spoke about persistence, he didn't mean discipline in the traditional sense. He meant consistency of identity, holding your new self-concept long enough for the field to fully conform. Because the truth is, identity is not instant. It is cumulative. It is relational. It forms slowly through what systems thinking calls adaptive stability, a phase in which the old feedback loop is breaking down, but the new one hasn't fully anchored. This is the most dangerous part of transformation, because in that in-between space, the field begins to test your signal. It throws contradictions at you, not maliciously, mechanically. Here's why. Your previous self-concept emitted a stable signal. That signal shaped your experiences. When you install a new identity, the field begins shifting, but much of your environment, memory, and emotional structure still reference the old signal. So the system resists. It wants to snap back into the shape it knows. It wants to stabilize what has the most historical data. Persistence is what tells the field, no, we're not going back. This is the new anchor. This is the point where people think they've failed. They say, why is everything falling apart? Why does this feel harder now than before? Why are people treating me differently? It's because collapse is working. The destabilization is a sign that the assumptions are being rewritten at the field level. You are rewiring your geometric structure. You are interrupting resonance patterns that have looped for years. You are introducing a frequency the system is not calibrated for yet, but it will be, if you persist. Persistence is about becoming unmoved, not emotionally dead, but structurally stable. It means holding the new identity in the face of contradictory evidence, behaving from the new state even when the environment reflects the old one, feeling the resonance of the chosen version even when nothing around you confirms it. That's not ignoring reality. That's replacing it. Because reality doesn't shift from confirmation. It shifts from alignment. And alignment must precede proof. Let's look at how this works in systems logic. A new identity creates a new attractor state in your consciousness. At first, the old attractor still dominates. That's why the system oscillates, moving between the new and old. But with each moment you hold your new identity without reverting, the old field loses coherence. And once the new attractor becomes more consistent than the old one, the system snaps into a new equilibrium. This is when life begins to change suddenly. This is when things start working. But it was never sudden. It was the result of persistent signal stabilization. Neville wrote, "Persist in the assumption that your desire is already fulfilled. For that assumption, though false at the moment, if persisted in, will harden into fact." What he's pointing to is temporal fidelity. You must outlast the delay between internal structure and external confirmation. That delay is not punishment. It is processing time. It is the field reshaping matter to reflect the new operator. And the only requirement of you during that reshaping is this: don't break alignment. Let's go deeper. Persistence doesn't mean acting blindly. It means recalibrating your reactions to match the new identity. So when challenge appears, you respond as the version of you who has already won. When fear surfaces, you interpret it as noise from the collapsing structure, not a warning from the future. This is how the nervous system learns the new normal. This is how the identity embeds. This is how the field receives the consistent broadcast it needs to finalize collapse. One of the biggest mistakes people make during this phase is asking, "But how long do I have to persist?" That question comes from the old self. It comes from conditional identity. I'll hold this new state until I get results. But conditional persistence breaks the pattern. It communicates to the field, this isn't permanent. I'm still unsure. I'm watching the clock. The correct frame is, I persist because this is who I am. Whether it shows up in 3 days or 3 years doesn't matter. That level of certainty ends the negotiation. And when there's no more negotiation, the field stops testing. It starts conforming. Understand this. The universe is not asking for effort. It's asking for consistency. not just in action but in assumption, resonance, and reaction. Persistence is not resistance. It's non-reversion. It's refusing to re-enter the outdated feedback loop. You don't need willpower. You need structure. You need to hold the form until it becomes unshakable. And it will, because the field always follows the most stable signal. This is why Neville never spoke about trying harder. He spoke about assuming and remaining faithful to that assumption. Because once identity stabilizes, behavior aligns. And once behavior aligns, the environment adjusts. And once the environment adjusts, the result is inevitable. So ask yourself, what version of myself am I refusing to revert from? What internal commitment have I made so deeply that no external condition can shake it? That's the true test of persistence. And that's how you become the stabilizer of your chosen reality. Next, we will address what most perceive as failure. Backlash, chaos, emotional turbulence. Why the mess is not the breakdown, but the confirmation that resolution is already in motion. You are not shaping your life by chance. You are operating it, whether you're aware of it or not. And the tool you're using to do that, every moment of every day, is identity. Identity is not how you define yourself in words. It's not your personality type. It's not what you post online or say in self-help journals. It is the patterned, subconscious structure that tells the quantum field what version of reality to resolve. It is your default broadcasting frequency. And unless you change it, nothing else truly changes. This is the core misunderstanding of transformation. People think their thoughts create reality. But thoughts follow identity. They think their feelings create reality. But feelings respond to identity alignment or misalignment. They think action creates reality. But action without identity change only reinforces the loop you're already in. Because the remote control, the device that selects your channel of reality, is the structure of who you believe yourself to be. Here's how this works. Every identity emits a set of expectations. Those expectations filter what you perceive. What you perceive filters what you believe is possible. What you believe is possible shapes how you act. And how you act shapes your outcomes. That means identity isn't one variable in the process. It's the source code. It's the root system. In system dynamics, we talk about attractor fields, states a system naturally returns to unless disrupted. Your identity is an attractor field. No matter how hard you try to change, if the identity remains the same, the system will always collapse back to its default state. You can change jobs. You can move cities. You can start a new relationship. But if you still carry the same identity configuration, you will recreate the same experiences in a new form. Neville didn't say, think differently. He said, change your concept of self. Because once identity shifts, everything else follows. Your thoughts reorganize. Your behavior adjusts. Your environment realigns. Not because of chance. Because the remote control has been switched to a new channel. Let's make this even more exact. You're not living reality. You're tuning into it. Like a radio, your consciousness emits a frequency. That frequency is encoded by identity. The field receives that frequency and says, here is the version of reality that matches. This isn't metaphor. This is mechanics. Now here's what makes this tricky. Your identity is mostly subconscious. You don't choose it once. You reinforce it thousands of times a day, through your choices, your reactions, your emotional tone, and your internal self-talk. Most of that reinforcement happens without awareness, which means if you don't become conscious of your identity field, it continues to select experiences you no longer want. This is why people feel stuck. It's not their thoughts. It's their signal. But here's the breakthrough. You can interrupt the default. You can upgrade the remote. You can change what reality resolves by reconfiguring the structure of your identity. Not with effort, with awareness and design. You begin by asking, what version of me has the life I want? What are their beliefs? How do they respond? What emotional baseline do they hold? What do they no longer tolerate? Then you start assuming that structure as real. Every moment, every decision, every emotion, That becomes your new broadcast. And here's the secret most don't know. Reality does not argue. It reflects. If you continue to assume a new identity, fully, repeatedly, and consistently, the field recalibrates. Because the field doesn't care what's true, cares what's consistent. And consistency is what switches the channel permanently. So stop focusing on your thoughts. Start observing your identity. Ask yourself, what am I broadcasting by default? What version of reality does my identity instruct the field to resolve? And what new structure would collapse the old one permanently? Because once you shift the remote, you never have to chase outcomes again. Next, we will explore the paradox that causes most people to give up. Why your greatest breakdown is often the final threshold before the system completes its reconfiguration. You've assumed a new identity. You've revised the old patterns. You've persisted long enough to override the emotional reflexes of your past self. And then, just when things feel like they're about to shift, everything collapses. Chaos erupts. Relationships break down. You lose clients. Unexpected bills show up. You feel disoriented, tired, doubtful. This is not failure. This is the backlash effect. And it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of identity transformation. Most people misread this part of the process. They assume that difficulty means something has gone wrong, that their assumption didn't work, that the field is rejecting their new reality. But none of that is true. What you're experiencing is the destabilization process, the collapse of the old structure trying to resist deletion. It is not personal. It is mechanical. Think of it this way. When you introduce a strong new input into any stable system, that system will react. Not because it wants to, but because it's designed to maintain equilibrium. Your identity is no different. Your nervous system, your emotional pathways, your thought cycles, all of them are structured to preserve continuity. The moment you destabilize the old identity through assumption, the system enters a state of energetic reorganization. That reorganization looks like emotional volatility, physical fatigue, confusion, loss of clarity, and even external disruptions. This is the price of collapse, and it's the final test of consistency. Neville hinted at this repeatedly, though never framed it in these terms. He spoke of remaining loyal to the end, even as the world contradicted you. What he was pointing to is this. When you switch timelines, the residual energy of the previous timeline flares up in one last attempt to stay dominant. It doesn't mean the new reality isn't forming. It means the old one is resisting deletion. Think about what happens when you uninstall software from a computer. It doesn't vanish quietly. It often asks for confirmation. It warns you that files will be lost. Sometimes it throws an error message. Not because it's alive, because it's structured to protect its own continuity. That's what's happening in your mind and field. Your old identity is trying to negotiate its survival. And if you listen to that negotiation, if you interpret chaos as a sign to revert, you'll re-anchor the exact structure you were dissolving. So how do you move through backlash? You stop interpreting turbulence as failure. You start recognizing it as energetic friction caused by internal recalibration. More precisely, you treat it as proof. Proof that the old version of you is being destabilized. Proof that the attractor field of your prior identity is losing coherence. And because systems abhor instability, the collapse intensifies right before stabilization. That's why this part feels the most intense. Because you're in the compression window. The system is being rewritten, and the feedback loop is resisting one last time. Let's frame it in quantum terms. When a wave function is collapsing into a new probability, the particles involved enter a temporary state of uncertainty and flux. Your lived version of that, mood swings, sudden doubt, people testing your boundaries, feeling like the new identity is too far away, that flux isn't random. It's a necessary disorder before the new resonance fully integrates. This is why persistence is phase 3, not phase 1. Because only when you encounter backlash does your assumption become real. You stop performing the new identity. You become it through unchangeable resolve, even as the mirror throws static back at you. This is not blind faith. This is structural discipline. This is energetic integrity. And this is what people call the quantum leap, but it's not really a leap. It's the collapse finalizing. So next time things seem to unravel after you've made a clear shift, remember, you're not going backwards. You're moving forward so fast the field is trying to catch up. Your job is to stop looking for proof. Hold the structure. Ignore the noise. Let the collapse finalize. You're not in chaos. You're in realignment. And the only thing you need to do is not flinch. Next, we will decode the mechanics behind Neville's most famous instruction, live in the end, and how this phrase is not philosophy, but a direct instruction on timeline collapse through boundary precision. Live in the end. It's one of Neville Goddard's most quoted teachings, repeated endlessly in books, podcasts, social media posts. But very few understand what it actually means. It's not poetic. It's not symbolic. It is a directive. And it comes with a very specific implication. Collapse all other reference points. To live in the end means to anchor your consciousness in a reality that hasn't yet shown up physically, but already exists energetically. It means selecting one version of reality and behaving, feeling, responding, and perceiving only from that reference point. No exit plan. No waiting mode. No when it happens. It's already done. And every aspect of your energetic structure must reflect that. In quantum mechanics, this concept maps directly to boundary conditions. In physics, a boundary condition defines what's allowed to happen within a given system. It determines what form a wave function collapses into. It defines limits not in space but in possibility. Living in the end is you choosing the boundary condition of your timeline. You are saying, this is the only outcome I will permit. That instruction narrows the field. It filters every interaction. It excludes everything that contradicts your selected outcome. Here's where people go wrong. They try to live in the end but still check in on their current circumstances. They revisit old emotional references. They look for signs that the end is coming. All of this communicates one thing to the field. This is a performance, not a structure. And the field responds accordingly. It mirrors inconsistency. But when you lock in, when you treat the end as your only point of reference, the feedback loop changes, the data stream rewrites, and reality organizes itself to fulfill that command. Neville gave this instruction because he understood that identity is not upgraded by logic. It is conditioned through finality. Living in the end means the assumption has already resolved. The resonance is normalized. The nervous system no longer detects any urgency, effort, or gap. You are home. Let's break it down practically. You want health? You live from the baseline of someone who never questions their vitality. You respond to stress like someone who trusts their body fully. You don't watch symptoms. You observe alignment. You want wealth? You don't wait for a number in the bank. You normalize the emotional tone of resource abundance. You remove urgency from decisions. That's how the field confirms the reality you've selected. It follows your certainty, not your need. Living in the end is also about timeline subtraction. The quantum field contains every version of you. When you live in the end, you collapse every alternative that contradicts it. You are no longer entertaining multiple outcomes. You are declaring, this is the final one. This is who I am. This is where this story ends. And the field mirrors finality, because finality is structure. When people fail to live in the end, they start negotiating. They look for signs. They seek evidence. They ask, is it working? But that question doesn't exist in the end. That question belongs to the version of you who hasn't arrived yet. So every time you ask it, you re-anchor into the version who's still waiting. And the field complies. Living in the end is also how you teach your nervous system the new reality. When you behave as if the end is here, your brain stops seeking. Your body stops preparing for threats. You shift out of cortisol-based identity into coherence. That coherence is what stabilizes the field around the chosen version of you. Not because it's magic, because it's a signal the field can actually resolve. Uncertainty? The field keeps fluctuating. Ambivalence? The wave doesn't collapse. But full-spectrum alignment with the end? Resolution. Let's take it deeper. Living in the end is not visualization. It's not mental rehearsal. It's structural replacement. You are saying, I no longer carry the frequency of hoping, wishing, or waiting. I only carry the code of having, being, and receiving. This is not about tricking the universe. It's about removing all conflicting data from the broadcast. And when that happens, reality stops negotiating. It fulfills. So now ask yourself, what would I stop doing if this were already done? What conversations would I stop having? What emotions would I stop feeding? What urgency would evaporate? That's the version of you who lives in the end. And that's the version of you the field responds to. Live there. And everything else organizes itself to match. Next, we will make sense of the multiverse through a non-mystical lens and explain why parallel timelines aren't fiction, but the most consistent interpretation of how the quantum field already operates. Parallel timelines are often dismissed as metaphysical fantasy. Too abstract, too unprovable, too out there. But here's the thing, this concept isn't just speculation. It's the logical conclusion of multiple serious models in theoretical physics. And it's the most coherent explanation for what Neville Goddard described as states of consciousness. Not separate universes, not alternate dimensions, but distinct coexisting timelines, each governed by a different identity field. Let's bring this into clarity. According to the many worlds interpretation in quantum mechanics, every time a decision is made or an observation occurs, the universe splits into every possible outcome. One version of you accepts the offer. One declines. One never got the call. One never heard about it in the first place. Each outcome doesn't erase the others. They all exist in superposition until observed. You're not moving through time. You're shifting reference frames. And those frames are selected based on frequency, on the internal signal of who you assume yourself to be. Neville never used the term multiverse, but when he said, all states already exist, he was pointing at the same mechanism. He wasn't teaching creation. He was teaching selection. And selection requires one thing: identity resonance. You're not building a new reality. You're tuning into the version that's already present and allowing the rest to collapse out of relevance. That's not wishful thinking. That's waveform resolution. Most people misunderstand the multiverse concept. They think of it as science fiction, multiple copies of you walking around simultaneously. That's a distraction. The practical truth is this: every possible version of you exists now, not later, not eventually, now. And your current identity is the filter determining which version of you becomes experiential. Let's say there's a version of you who is financially free, deeply connected in love, confident, fulfilled, aligned. That version is not in the future. It is in a different trajectory. And that trajectory becomes available when your identity collapses into harmony with it. Until then, it remains unselected, non-localized. That's what makes identity work so radical. It's not about improvement. It's about timeline access. In practical terms, this means when you assume a new identity without contradiction, when you revise the memories anchoring the old one, when you persist long enough through backlash, you are not earning a better life. You are matching the vibrational geometry of a different timeline. And that geometry contains different people, events, insights, and outcomes. Not because they're rewards, but because they're resonant with that frequency. Neville's states aren't internal moods. They are entire configurations of reality. Each state contains its own logic, its own default expectations, its own emotional weather, its own opportunities and friction points. You don't carry your current state into the new one. You abandon it, you collapse it, and you stabilize something entirely new. This is why so many people fail to manifest their goals. They bring old assumptions into the new desire. But the timeline can't support contradictory identity frequencies. Think of it like this. Each timeline is like a radio channel. You can't hear what's on 107.2 if your dial is locked at 93.5. You can want it. You can visualize it. You can affirm that you're worthy of it. But unless your dial shifts, you'll never receive the broadcast. Identity is the dial. It tunes your consciousness into a specific timeline, and resonance is what keeps it locked in. This is also why outcomes appear out of nowhere once identity aligns. It's not that you suddenly created a result. It's that you moved into the version of yourself for whom that result is already stabilized. You didn't manifest it. You matched it. And once matched, the quantum field filtered out everything that no longer fit. That's why old friends disappear. That's why past habits feel irrelevant. That's why sudden synchronicities explode in your awareness. The timeline has changed. The key is to stop thinking in terms of goals and start thinking in terms of identity frames. Ask, who do I have to become to match the version of reality I want? What assumptions does that version of me carry? What does that version no longer tolerate? What would feel normal to that version? Because normal is the baseline that anchors timelines. Not fantasy, not hype, not emotional peaks. What you normalize is what stabilizes. So the goal isn't to chase new experiences. It's to shift into the version of you for whom those experiences are already encoded into the structure. That's not magic. That's alignment. The multiverse isn't abstract. It's operational. And your life will continue to echo the same experiences until you become conscious of the fact that you are not stuck. You're simply tuned in to a signal that doesn't match your desires. The moment you change the signal, the broadcast changes. And the field doesn't ask permission. It just responds. Next, we will complete this system by tying together the three phases: revision, assumption, and persistence, and frame the final truth. You don't attract reality, you resolve it. It's time to abandon the model of life that has kept so many stuck, chasing outcomes from a place of separation. You are not here to attract. You are here to resolve. That's the final insight. That's the completed circuit. Neville's three-phase collapse formula isn't about manifesting. It's about ending the delay between who you are and what shows up. Because in quantum terms, nothing is truly attracted. It is resolved into visibility based on what you stabilize as identity. Let's make this unmistakably clear. Phase 1, revision, destabilizes the anchor points of your past. It erases the feedback loops that bind you to unwanted experiences. It breaks the story you've been unconsciously reinforcing. You stop referencing past events as fixed. You overwrite them. You assign new meanings. You disrupt the emotional signature that holds them in place. Revision collapses your resonant history, not through denial but through strategic redesign. Phase 2, assumption, selects the version of reality you now wish to inhabit. It doesn't request. It declares. You are not waiting for the desired version of yourself to arrive. You are becoming it now as a structural fact. Assumption is your observer effect. It collapses all other possibilities into irrelevance. It sets the frequency that tells the field, only this identity exists. And the field listens, because it always listens to identity, not intent. Phase 3, persistence, locks in the change. It ends negotiation. It is the refusal to flinch when the mirror pushes back. It is the choice to remain aligned with the new version, no matter what echoes from the old timeline still appear. Persistence is the bridge between initiation and finalization. Without it, the formula short-circuits. With it, the collapse completes. These three phases form a closed loop. Revision clears the space. Assumption sets the new path. Persistence holds the field until the external reflects it back. This is how you resolve unwanted reality. You don't attract a better one. You overwrite the energetic software that held the old one together. Every experience you have is the result of an identity you've either chosen or inherited. And the quantum field, neutral and precise, mirrors back whatever identity is stabilized. No bias, no delay, no exceptions. This isn't about morality. It's not about worthiness. It's about signal fidelity. What you resolve internally becomes inevitable externally. Because once a new identity becomes normalized, your perception, your behavior, your expectations, and your opportunities shift in perfect harmony. And the timeline adjusts itself. So the question is no longer, how do I attract what I want? The real question is, what version of me already lives in that outcome? And what's stopping me from stabilizing that version now? Every second you remain in misalignment is a second the field mirrors back your current identity. Not to punish, but to reflect. Neville's formula is not abstract mysticism. It's a system. It is the human instruction set for collapsing and resolving realities. And when you apply it precisely, outcomes no longer feel random. They become direct reflections of your internal architecture. So here's the invitation. Stop playing by outdated models. Stop waiting. Stop hoping. Start resolving. With clarity. With precision. With identity. You're not here to magnetize your future. You're here to walk into it as the only version of you the field can recognize. And once you do, the reality you thought was coming arrives instantly, because it was never separate from you to begin with. You just had to stop broadcasting the version of you that couldn't hold it. Revision, assumption, persistence. That's the formula. That's the map. That's the final collapse. The modern self-help world is saturated with language that creates more separation than empowerment. You're told to attract what you want, to raise your vibration so something better can find you, to wait for the universe to deliver once you're worthy, ready, or aligned enough. This paradigm is seductive but misleading. It subtly teaches you to frame your desires as distant. It reinforces the idea that you're incomplete. And it builds a psychological model where you must earn what you want through emotional labor. But that is not how the quantum field works. That is not how identity operates. And that is not how reality resolves. The truth is much simpler and far more empowering. You don't attract. You don't summon. You don't wait. You resolve. You collapse all alternative outcomes by stabilizing one identity so fully, so consistently, and so coherently that the field has no other option but to comply. When Neville Goddard taught his system, he wasn't offering a mindset technique. He wasn't interested in affirmations for the sake of emotion. He was presenting a mechanism, a precise, identity-driven formula designed to instruct consciousness to collapse a specific version of reality. And that formula remains intact today, unchanged, untarnished by trend cycles, untouched by the motivational industry. It is direct. It is logical. It is self-contained. It requires three things: clear revision of your internal past, absolute assumption of your selected identity, unwavering persistence through the recalibration process. And when these three are present, without contradiction, resolution becomes automatic. Let's bring it into final clarity. Every outcome you've ever experienced was not attracted. It was resolved by the identity you were stabilizing at that time. Your job, your income, your relationships, your physical condition, your sense of safety or instability. None of it arrived randomly. They were all resolved because of the version of you you kept returning to, day after day, thought after thought, reaction after reaction, not consciously, mechanically. And once you understand this, the entire structure of your life becomes transparent. Not because you're analyzing it endlessly, but because you recognize the true operator, you. Not you as a personality. Not you as a persona. You as the selector of timelines. You as the broadcaster of frequency. You as the stabilizer of quantum potential. That's not spiritual hyperbole. It's physics applied to consciousness. So now we arrive at the final truth. You don't get what you want. You get what you stabilize. And the act of stabilization happens through repetition, through rehearsal, through behavior, through internal dialogue, through what you assume is normal. That's what the field responds to. Not your desire, not your excitement, not your pain. Only the dominant structure of identity. This is why people can affirm one thing and receive the opposite. Because the affirmation was weak, but the identity was strong. because the declaration was intellectual, but the emotional blueprint was unchanged. Desire doesn't move the field. Structure does. So stop asking for the future. Step into the version of you who already lives in it. Anchor that version through revision, clearing old signatures; assumption, setting new defaults; persistence, holding position under pressure. And when you stop reverting, reality stops negotiating. The mirror stops lagging. The noise quiets, not because you became worthy, but because you stopped contradicting your own broadcast. Neville said, "The world is yourself pushed out." Now, you understand the literal meaning of that sentence. The world around you is not random. It is not fixed. It is a delayed reflection of what you stabilize internally, whether by intention or by habit. You are not a passive observer. You are not a beggar waiting for universal approval. You are the architect of the frequency field through which probability collapses into matter. That means, if you want a new life, stop chasing it. Occupy it. If you want different outcomes, stop journaling about them. Normalize them. If you want a new level of fulfillment, stop craving it. Assume the version of you who already considers it ordinary. That's how the formula works. That's how timelines resolve. You've now walked through the entire mechanism. There is no mystery left. Only responsibility. This is not a model for the faint-hearted. It requires precision. It requires clarity. It requires the willingness to unlearn comfort in exchange for agency. But the reward? Freedom. Not the freedom to fantasize. The freedom to select. To exit any reality you've outgrown. To stabilize any future you're ready for. To stop outsourcing your power and start operating like the field-resolving instrument you've always been. So pause here and take inventory. What have you been stabilizing unconsciously? What identity loop have you mistaken for truth? What version of yourself has been making your selections while you were waiting for evidence? And most importantly, what version of you are you ready to normalize now? Not dream about, not visualize, normalize. Because the moment it becomes normal, it becomes stabilized. And the moment it's stabilized, the field complies. No negotiation, no resistance, no exception. The three-phase collapse formula isn't something to try, something to operate. It is the most precise mechanism for conscious quantum resolution available. And it places the entire responsibility and freedom exactly where it belongs, within you. There is nothing left to attract. There is only resolution. So step forward now, not as someone hoping, not as someone scripting, but as someone selecting. Because that's what you were designed to do. That's what you've always been doing, consciously or not. And now, you get to do it with clarity, with intention, with finality. This is not manifestation. This is not spirituality. This is resolution through identity. And when you master that, the field doesn't just shift. It aligns. Instantly, permanently, precisely.